He stopped as if he had forgotten how to breathe. The metallic sound of the key still echoed in the lock, mingling with the distant echo of a seemingly impossible laugh. The Chinese millionaire, dressed in his impeccable dark blue suit, fresh from another business trip, stood frozen in the doorway of his San Francisco mansion. The man who dominated boardrooms, who never trembled in the face of billion-dollar contracts, was now paralyzed, unable to take a single step forward. And if you've ever gotten goosebumps just imagining a father hearing his daughter laugh after so much time in silence, allow me an invitation. Sign up now, because stories like this, full of emotion, pain, and overcoming, can transform the way you see life, and I want you to be with me in each one of them. The scene before him was not only unexpected, it was devastating and fascinating at the same time. In the heart of the luxurious kitchen, bathed in golden light streaming through the immense windows, her 4-year-old daughter hung around the maid's neck. But it was no ordinary scene. The young black woman, just 24, was dressed like a grandmother from an old movie. A long floral dress covered her legs. A colorful shawl swayed over her shoulders with every movement. Her simple apron clashed with the brightness of the modern kitchen, and her oversized glasses, perched on the tip of her nose, gave her the appearance of someone much older. And yet nothing seemed ridiculous. On the contrary, it carried a tenderness that was almost impossible to bear. The girl laughed so hard that it echoed off the cold marble walls, warming every corner of that mansion that, since her mother's death, felt more like a museum than a home. It was a belly laugh, a laugh of innocence, a laugh of life, a laugh the millionaire hadn't heard in months. His right hand still held tightly to the leather briefcase. He was trying to take a deep breath, but the air seemed to grate on his lungs. How could he? Why did his daughter call that young woman grandfather? "Daddy, look," the little girl cried, her eyes shining. "Grandma's back." His heart skipped a beat. His wife had passed away years ago, and the word grandma was no longer part of the routine in that house. What did that mean? The maid noticed her presence. For a moment she froze, surprised by her unexpected arrival, but she didn't try to justify herself. She simply adjusted the girl's position on her back and maintained a firm smile, as if she knew she wasn't committing a crime, just being in love. The millionaire swallowed hard. Every cell in his body screamed for control, but the words slipped out like stones. What does this mean? The girl's laughter immediately died away. She clung even tighter to the maid's neck, hiding her face in her colorful shawl. Silence fell over the kitchen like a thunderless storm. He took a step inside, the soles of his shoes echoing against the marble floor. He slammed the door shut behind him, as if he could regain authority in the sound of the impact. But inside, something in him had already broken. He took another deep breath, and his voice came out deeper, harder, as if he were trying to convince himself that he was still in charge of this place. I asked, "What does this mean?" The young woman slowly raised her face. Her large glasses reflected the golden light streaming through the window. Her eyes, however, didn't tremble. There was no fear. There was firmness. There was compassion. There was something he couldn't quite name. "It just means she laughed," he said softly. "And laughter is all a child needs to believe they're safe." He felt the words cut through him like a blade. Who was she to talk about safety? He was the father, the owner of the house, the provider of everything. But at the same time, he couldn't deny the obvious. His daughter was smiling in her arms, not his. Silence grew between them again. He pressed his fingers against the leather folder, trying to regain his composure, but his eyes never left the scene. His daughter hugging a young woman dressed as a grandmother, breathing peace while he himself seemed like an intruder in his own home. His throat hurt. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tear the girl away, push the maid away, regain control. But all that came out was a whisper. "Why do you dress like that?" The girl, clinging to the maid's neck, tightened her embrace as if sensing the tension. The maid took a deep breath. She didn't answer right away, and in that heavy silence, he realized that perhaps the answer was much deeper than he was willing to hear. She adjusted her glasses, lifted her chin, and still without justifying herself, simply said, "Because sometimes you have to dress up in love for a child to believe in it." The millionaire felt his breath catch. His daughter, so small, laughed again, this time quieter, shyer but still genuine, as if her words had restored the breath that tension had stolen. And it was in that instant that he realized the question that would torment him was not who she was, but rather why a 24-year-old girl needed to dress like a grandmother to make her daughter smile again. Dinner that night felt more like a courtroom than a family meal. The mahogany table, polished like a mirror, reflected the cool light of the crystal chandelier suspended over the center. Dishes were lined up with precision. Silverware gleamed hand. The napkin folded into a perfect triangle. Everything exuded discipline and order, but there was no smell of home. There was no warmth, only silence. The kind of silence that weighs so heavily that even the sound of breathing seems inadequate. The millionaire sat at the head of the table, his posture erect, his gaze fixed on the plate before him, but his eyes saw nothing. His face was a mask, but inside, his chest was boiling. Every time he remembered what he'd seen earlier, his daughter smiling in the maid's arms, dressed like a caricature of a grandmother, a mixture of anger and insecurity consumed him. He cleared his throat, and the sound resounded like a warning gong. "In here," he said, his voice deep and firm. "There are rules." The little girl sitting next to the maid looked up in alarm. The fork in her trembling hand clinked against the plate. He continued, now looking at the young woman with the large glasses. "I don't tolerate acting. I don't tolerate fantasies. My daughter doesn't need cheap tricks. She needs discipline. She needs limits. She needs me." The sentence echoed harshly through the room. The girl lowered her head, trying to hide her face. Her lips trembled. The maid, however, remained firm. She adjusted her shawl over her shoulders, took a deep breath, and only then did she respond, calmly and softly, yet firmly enough that every syllable was an affront to his coldness. "Rules may keep a house in order, sir, but they don't cure the silence of an empty room. They don't soothe the heart of a child who wakes in the middle of the night and finds no one there." The millionaire pressed his fingers against the table, his knuckles turning white. The maid wasn't speaking arrogantly. She was speaking truthfully, and perhaps that was what irritated him most. He slammed his fist against the table, and the sound made the crystal of the chandelier vibrate. "You don't know anything about this house. You don't know anything about me." The girl swallowed, her eyes welling up. Her heart seemed torn between two worlds. The father she respected but who frightened her, and the maid, who dressed as a grandmother just so she could sleep in peace. Then, in an unexpected gesture, the child pushed back the chair, ran to the maid and threw herself into her arms, clinging to her apron with all the strength of someone who fears losing the little security she has. "Daddy," she cried softly, "I just want to sleep without nightmares." Her voice was so small, so broken that even the millionaire's iron heart seemed to waver for a moment. He looked away, squeezing his eyes shut, as if trying to shield himself from an invisible blade. The maid hugged the girl gently, stroking her straight hair, and looked up at him again. Her glasses reflected the golden candlelight, but behind them was something unbreakable. "She doesn't need rules, sir. She needs someone to make her laugh again." The millionaire felt anger burn in his chest. It was as if someone had invaded his territory and taken what was rightfully his. He was the father. He was the provider. He had given his daughter everything money could buy, but none of that was worth a hug dressed as a grandmother. He took a deep breath, trying to regain his composure, and said in a low, almost threatening tone, "I'm going to find out who you really are." The maid didn't back down. She hugged the girl to her chest and replied, "Find out then. But until then, know that I won't let you go." Silence fell back over the table. The candle flames flickered slightly, as if reflecting the tension in the air. The millionaire stood slowly, his chair creaking on the floor. He looked at the two of them, his daughter hidden in the maid's lap, and felt more like a stranger in his own home than ever. He walked to the window, parted the curtains, and gazed out at the illuminated city. But the lights of San Francisco brought him no peace, only memories. Memories of the wife he'd lost, the laughter of the daughter who'd disappeared with her, and how somewhere along the line, the mansion he'd built with such pride had become a cold, empty glass castle. For a moment, doubt flashed through his mind like a flash of lightning. Was he wrong? Had he hardened his heart so much that he no longer knew what true love was? But he brushed the thought away like a bug. He turned again, his face hard, and declared, "I want an answer tomorrow. I want to know why you dress like that. And if you don't like what you hear, you can pack your things." The maid just nodded. There was no fear in her eyes. There was something bigger, a secret. The millionaire sat back down but didn't touch his food. He stood there in silence, feeling the weight of his own threat. And for the first time in many years, he realized he had no control whatsoever. And so, that night, a promise formed within him to discover the truth, no matter the cost. Because no one would steal his father's place in his own home. The mansion was plunged into silence, but the millionaire paced back and forth in his office like a prisoner, a barren space. The expensive furniture, the books lined high on the shelves, the leather smell of the armchairs, nothing brought him peace. The wall clock ticked cruelly every second, reminding him that, even surrounded by luxury, he had no control over the only thing that truly mattered, his daughter's laughter. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the scene again. The girl giggling in the maid's arms, dressed like a grandmother. The colorful shawl, the large glasses, the tenderness in every gesture, and the question throbbed like fire. Why would a young woman of only 24 choose to hide her youth behind old clothes and ladylike adornments? When the early morning hours became unbearable, he decided he would wait no longer. He would get answers. At dawn, he went down to the kitchen. He found her there, as if nothing had happened, preparing breakfast. The smell of fresh bread wafted through the air, mingled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. The girl was sitting on the counter, swinging her legs, smiling, helping to knead the dough with her flour-covered hands. The scene, so simple, felt like a stab in the back. He, who had given his daughter everything, imported toys, expensive clothes, renowned doctors, hadn't been able to return that smile. But there she was, smiling because of a woman who wasn't even family. He straightened his tie and cleared his throat, his voice thick with authority. "I need an explanation. Now." The maid took her time. She finished placing the tray on the table, wiped her hands on her apron, and only then looked at him, adjusting her large glasses on the tip of her nose. "What do you want to know?" He stepped closer, the shadow of his figure casting over her. "Why do you dress like that?" he asked through gritted teeth. "Why do you turn into an old woman in front of my daughter? What do you mean by that?" The girl's eyes widened, startled by her father's tone. The maid, however, remained firm. She took a deep breath, placed her hand on the child's hair, and spoke softly but clearly. "Because it's not fantasy. It's a promise." The millionaire frowned. "Promise?" She nodded. Her eyes darkened with memories. "Years ago I volunteered at a hospital," she began, her voice trembling but steady. "There was a sick, lonely boy who prayed every day for his grandmother. She was no longer alive. No one could answer his prayers. I didn't know what to do. So I grabbed a forgotten shawl, draped it over my shoulders, improvised large reading glasses, and became the grandmother he needed." She swallowed hard, her eyes welling up, but she didn't look away. That night, he slept peacefully, and I realized that sometimes it's not age that matters, but the feeling of being held. Since then, when I see a scared child, I fill in the gaps. It's not a disguise. It's love. The kitchen fell silent. The millionaire blinked several times, as if trying to dispel the force of those words. A part of him wanted to believe them, but another, wounded and suspicious, screamed that something was hidden. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his mind still restless, and opened the reports his lawyer had sent him months earlier, documents he hadn't bothered to read carefully. As he swiped the screen, a word jumped out: resignation, other, accident. The blood rushed to his face. He looked up at her and his voice was filled with venom. "So that's it. You're not the saint you pretend to be. You were fired. You have a history. You're using this grandma act to deceive my daughter." The girl, frightened, grabbed the maid's arm. "Daddy, no, she doesn't lie." The young woman didn't immediately defend herself. She simply squeezed the little girl's hand, took a deep breath, and replied firmly, "There are papers that tell an incomplete story, sir. Papers record failures, but they don't show what someone does when no one is looking." He laughed bitterly. "Fine words do not erase official reports." Silence fell. The girl cried softly, clinging to the maid's lap. And the millionaire, torn between the cold logic of the documents and the vivid warmth of the scene, felt increasingly lost. But deep down, a certainty was forming. He would go all the way. He would find out the whole truth, no matter the cost. The report seemed to burn in his hands, even though it was just a lit screen. The millionaire kept his eyes fixed on the cold words: dismissal, incident, warning. Digital letters that, to him, sounded like screams. His blood boiled in his veins and every heartbeat seemed to echo in his ears. He looked up, breathing heavily, and stared at the young maid standing beside his daughter. Her colorful shawl fell from one shoulder. Her large glasses reflected the cold kitchen light, but there was an almost defiant serenity in her gaze. "So it's true," he said, his voice cracking with anger. "You were fired, accused, branded, and yet you came into this house pretending to be someone you're not. The daughter's eyes widened, the fork falling from her little hand with a clink that sounded like thunder in the silence. "Daddy, no!" she screamed, running to the maid. "She's not faking!" The young woman took a deep breath. She didn't rush to defend herself. She slowly ran her hand through the girl's straight hair and spoke firmly, but in a low tone, as if each word were measured. "There are papers that carry accusations, sir. But papers never tell the whole story. They don't show what a person did when no one was looking." The millionaire slammed his palm against the table, and the sound reverberated throughout the room. "Don't try to fool me with speeches. Records don't lie." The maid held his gaze. Her hands trembled slightly, but there was no fear in her eyes, only a strange dignity. Sometimes records lie by omission. The daughter, crying, placed herself between the two, her arms open like a small shield. "Enough," the girl sobbed. "Daddy, please don't take her away from me. She's my grandmother at heart." The millionaire's heart sank as it hadn't in years. He looked at his daughter, his own flesh and blood, clinging to the lap of a young woman who had nothing to do with the family. He felt a mixture of jealousy, fear, and helplessness. How could he lose his place in his own home? He closed his eyes for a moment, and memories came back like stabs. His wife, lying in a hospital bed, her last fragile smile before the darkness, his daughter's cries in the nights that followed, the expensive toys that wouldn't silence the pain, the doctors who didn't provide answers. And now, suddenly, a stranger returned the laughter he hadn't been able to summon. He swallowed hard and said in a voice filled with contained anger, "If you really have nothing to hide, prove it. Show who you really are." The maid took a deep breath. Tears threatened to escape, but she maintained her dignity. "Just give me one night," he asked. "A bus to the other side of town, and 10 minutes of your time." He frowned in surprise. "One night? A bus? What do you expect to show me?" She bent down, looked into her daughter's eyes, and then looked up again. "I want to show the truth, but not the one written in reports. The truth that lives in the people I helped." The millionaire fell silent. The proposal seemed absurd, but the firmness in her voice intrigued him. The daughter wiped her tears with the back of her hand and pulled her father's arm. "Please, Daddy, let her show you." He took a deep breath. He wasn't convinced, but there was something in those words that bothered him more than anger, the possibility that he might be wrong. He turned to the window. The city outside glowed with artificial lights, but inside the darkness was heavy. Finally, he said in a low tone, "Very well. One night. 10 minutes. I want to see if this is all just an act." The maid nodded silently. The millionaire picked up his cell phone again and turned off the screen, but deep down, a flame of distrust still burned, and it was at that point that he realized, maybe the truth was much bigger than any accusation on paper. Night fell over San Francisco like a heavy veil. The fog drifting in from the bay slowly engulfed the streets, and the streetlights created golden halos that seemed to float in the air. Inside a regular bus, a vehicle he hadn't ridden in years, the millionaire sat uncomfortably, like a stranger in a world he no longer recognized. The leather seats were worn, the air smelled of dust and gasoline, and all around were the weary faces of workers returning home. In the front row, the 24-year-old maid held a colorful shawl around her shoulders and a small leather briefcase against her chest. Her eyes fixed on the window reflected the lights of the city rushing by, but it was as if they were looking much further away. Beside her, her daughter slept propped up, her head resting peacefully, free from nightmares. His heart sank. It was in this young woman's arms that the girl found rest, not his. He broke the silence with a hoarse voice. "Where exactly are we going?" She didn't turn around. She just replied, "To the only place where papers don't tell the whole story." The bus jolted to a stop in front of a plain building with peeling walls and a faded sign that read Hope Community Center. The millionaire frowned. Hope, a word he had long since forgotten the flavor of. Inside, the walls were covered with murals of photographs. Smiling children, young people dressed curiously, shawls, glasses, floral dresses. He drew closer and realized they were volunteers like her, who described themselves as grandmothers on loan to orphaned or estranged children. The maid stopped before one photo in particular. Her finger trembled as she pointed to it. A boy with huge eyes, frail, and a shy smile. "That boy," she said, her voice breaking. There was no one there. He was just crying for his grandmother. That night there was a commotion in the cafeteria, people running, screaming. I grabbed him and left through the emergency exit. I broke the rules. I saved him, but I lost my job. The millionaire remained silent. His daughter ran down the hallway, fascinated by the photos, until she returned holding the maid's hand tightly. "Daddy, look," she said, her eyes shining. She did this to all the children. He felt a lump rise in his throat. He looked around. Dozens of children in the photos, all smiling in a way that reminded him of the smile he'd seen on his daughter that afternoon. And for the first time, the accusations in the report seemed so small compared to the truth that was written on those walls. He swallowed hard, his voice cracking as he tried to speak. "So, you never used that mask to deceive. You used it to protect." She looked at him firmly. "I wear it to give what's missing. When a child needs to feel like there's still someone who cares, I wear whatever it takes." The millionaire closed his eyes. He felt the wall of pride he had built around himself crumble little by little. An old memory surfaced, his wife asking him, before leaving, to care for their daughter with love, not just resources. He had failed. A stranger reminded him of that now, but before he could say anything, his cell phone vibrated in his pocket. He answered it almost reflexively. On the other end, his mother's voice, hard, implacable. "I'm at your house. I arrived early. Tomorrow this farce of this maid will end." His heart raced. He looked at the young woman before him, at his daughter hugging her, and felt the weight of a war about to begin. And in that instant he understood. The real confrontation would not be with papers or accusations, but with his own family, and perhaps with himself. Dinner that night tasted like war. The mahogany table, gleaming under the cool glow of the crystal chandelier, looked more like a courtroom than a place to share food. The aligned cutlery, the crystal-clear glasses, the heavy silence, everything announced that something was about to be judged there. The millionaire stood at the head of the table, his posture rigid but his heart pounding. To his right, his daughter fiddled nervously with her napkin, her anxious little eyes searching for protection. To his left, the young maid, still in her grandmotherly guise, shawl, large glasses, floral dress, held the girl's small hand under the table in a silent gesture of comfort. Then the door opened. The millionaire's mother entered, elegant, haughty, wrapped in a silk coat. She walked to the opposite end of the table as if she owned the place. Her sharp eyes scanned each face until they settled on the young maid. There was no greeting, no smile, just the sentence, "This farce ends today." The daughter's eyes widened, her breath short. The millionaire tried to speak, but her mother held up her hand, imposing silence. "A maid can't play family," he said firmly, "much less dress up as something she's not supposed to be to fool a child." The young woman didn't back down. She straightened her shoulders, adjusted her large glasses that were slipping down the bridge of her nose, and replied in a calm voice, yet firm enough to shake even the crystal of the glasses. "I dress this way because sometimes a child needs the smell of a lap before they even understand what love is. It's not a fantasy. It's care." The millionaire closed his eyes, as if the force of those words were too much to bear. His mother, however, slammed her palm against the table. "Insolent," he shouted. "You dare defy me in my own home?" The daughter couldn't take it anymore. She jumped from her chair and ran into the maid's arms, hugging her tightly, tears streaming down her little face. "Don't take her away from me," she cried, sobbing. "She's my grandmother. She's the one I sleep with without fear." Silence fell like a wave. The millionaire looked at his mother, who remained rigid, and at his daughter, who cried, hugging the young woman, and felt the weight of a decision that could change everything. The maid stroked the girl's hair and, even with a choked voice, spoke with dignity. "I don't want anyone's place. I just want this child to feel that the world can still be good, even when it hurts." It was then that something broke inside the old woman. Her face, rigid as stone, began to crack with lines of pent-up pain. Tears welled up discreetly at first, then spilled uncontrollably. She placed a hand on her chest, trembling, and whispered, "I had forgotten what it was like to hold a child after death took my daughter-in-law." The maid, in an unexpected gesture, took the colorful shawl from her shoulders and placed it delicately on the matriarch's shoulders. "Then sing with me," he asked softly, "because sometimes 3 voices together can heal what one alone cannot." The daughter looked at her grandmother, still crying, and asked innocently, "Grandma, sing, please." And in that instant, the mansion that had for so long been a castle of silence and rule filled with something new, 3 voices intertwining in a simple song, that of the sweet child, the firm young woman, and the trembling but sincere old woman. The millionaire watched, his eyes brimming, unable to control the torrent of emotions that overflowed. For a moment he believed peace had finally arrived. For the first time in years, home felt alive. But then, the cell phone vibrated on the table. He looked at the screen. An anonymous message. Just one sentence. She didn't tell you everything. Ask her about the night she disappeared. His blood ran cold. The voices continued to sing, but his heart was already elsewhere, in the abyss of doubt that was opening up again, and he realized, perhaps the worst was yet to come.